I'm now going to take you a little bit into history, the history of those ties between India and the Middle East, and why the new route is particularly important, even from a historical point of view. Which of these visuals represents globalization? On the left, you see a scene from hundreds and thousands of years ago. Horses and mules and creaking wooden ships with sails, carrying goods from one place to another over weeks and months, sometimes years. On the right, we see a scene from today. High-tech ships, trucks and planes which can take cargo across countries in a matter of hours. So I ask again, which of these represents globalization? How about both of them? Last week, when the leaders of India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, European Union, France, Germany, and Italy, and USA all came together to announce that setting up of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, one phrase which immediately cropped up was a new spice route. Now, that's an important phrase because the old spice route was actually thousands of years old. So there's a history for this and a precedent for this. Many experts say it was this spice route, the old spice route, which really kick-started globalization in the first place, connecting dozens of regions and cultures over land and over sea. Air didn't exist at that time, obviously. This also led to the development of infrastructure at ports and along land routes in the entire region. These spice routes were established around 3000 BC, would you believe it, that long back. They linked Japan, Indonesia, India, Middle East, Europe and Africa. The spice routes covered a distance of 15,000 kilometers. India, as the leading spice producer and as the country which was at the center of all of this, was the central point, obviously. Goods like ivory, silk, porcelain, gems and metals were also traded through these routes. This map shows how the spice route connected the east to the west, with the ancient Indian ports playing a key role, being the focus, being the pivot, being the fulcrum of all of this. There was Muziris, a major point in the route, which lay in present-day Kerala. Historians have found that 31 countries in Europe, Asia and the Far East had a spice trade with ancient Kerala, including Afghanistan, Burma, China, but also Denmark, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Malaysia, Mozambique, the Netherlands, Oman, Portugal, Spain. All of these countries were linked with ancient India. Another important port in ancient India was Kamara in what is now Tamil Nadu. Further up, there was Barigaza, what is now called Bharuch, and Barbaricum near present-day Karachi, which of course is in Pakistan. And there was a big tug-of-war between the Arabs and the Europeans to later control this trade because of how valuable it was. So as ancient India and the ancient world moved to the medieval times and towards the modern times, these linkages, these trade points continued to become important. That entire tussle between the Muslim world and the Europeans, which we saw in the 17th century or the 18th century, was again linked with these trade routes. Now, the launching of the IMEC has, of course, been compared to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which itself has been compared to the historical Silk Road. But remember, many have argued that the Silk Road, the Silk Route that we keep hearing about, was nothing but a pale shadow of the spice route in ancient times. The spice routes were established around 2,000 years before the Silk Road. The Silk Road covered around 6,000 kilometers, much less than the 15,000 kilometers long spice route. The Silk Road was land-based, while the spice route was maritime. The Silk Road linked with China, obviously. The spice route had India at the center of it. And of course, there was a darker side to this entire history. All the fame of these spices and that wealth of the East did start to resonate in the West, and that lucrative trade eventually brought in colonial powers to India. It began with the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama discovering a new route to India by sailing around Africa, mainly to break the control of the Arabs over the spice route. Where was that? trade originated, the same sort of connections that we are now talking about. And over the next 200 years, obviously, the Dutch and the English East India companies entered the picture, taking over the Indian Ocean trade. By reviving the ancient spice route, it can be said that India is not just reclaiming its spot as the central point of global trade, but also shedding yet another colonial shroud. Now, I began by talking about globalization across the world. And across the world, a debate has been raging for some time. Is the era of globalization over? Are countries and leaders turning insular, closing themselves off, rather than strengthening their links to other countries? If this is true, and it has been happening, then potentially this decision to launch the IMEC could not have come at a better time. Like thousands of years ago, India might once again help to connect the world, ushering in potentially a new era of globalization. And that would actually make perfect sense, because that matches the mantra that India was talking about so much at the G20, Vasudev Kutumbakam. Well, as you can tell, talking about those ancient maritime connections is a particular obsession of mine. So it's a great pleasure now to welcome onto the program somebody else who's been talking about it very, very extensively, somebody else for whom it is an obsession. Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and also the author of the book Ocean of Churn, somebody who's been studying all of those relations, working actually on a ship also to sail from Kalinga to Indonesia if all goes well. Sanjeev Sanyal, thank you so much for joining us. You know, I've been talking about the fact that this corridor is very exciting, India being linked to the Middle East, linked to Saudi Arabia, but this is only returning to a historical truth. This was a historical connection that existed for centuries between India and the Middle East and other countries on the old spice route. You've written about it, you've spoken so much about it. Tell us about the history of all of this.
Absolutely. You know, people talk a lot about the Silk Route through Central Asia, but in fact, Central Asia, the Silk Route was a minor route, which was only traversable once in a while when, say, people like the Mongols united it in the 13th century. But for most of the time, the real trade routes were maritime. And this goes back all the way to Harappan time. So when you look at a map and look at Dholavira, for example, today it looks like it's somewhere inland, but in fact it was a major port in the estuary of the Indus and the Saraswati. And from there, you could sail out towards Oman. This is 4,000, 5,000 years back. People were sailing out along the Makran coast, out to Oman, or out all the way through to Mesopotamia. And from there were trade routes that went even further westward to the Mediterranean, and in fact went all the way even to Egypt. So there is a Egyptian pharaoh from 4,000 years ago, and when they opened up his mummy, they discovered peppercorns up his nostrils. And now the question is, how did it get there? Because black pepper is an Indian plant. So the only way it would get there is that it made its way from Kerala, where it's native, went all the way to Gujarat, to the port, Harappan ports there, went then to Mesopotamia, or perhaps up the Red Sea, we don't know for sure, and then ended up in Egypt, where it was stuffed up the nostril of a Egyptian pharaoh's mummy.
You know, it's interesting that as we look at history, and we discussed this in the past, India sort of had a bit of a land fixation, you know, Khyber Pass or XYZ, the land boundaries. It's only now that we are really starting to talk or rediscover the fact that India actually had a very rich maritime history. Cholas in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, Kerala and the Malabar coast and its ties with with countries to the west, with Africa and with the Middle East. These maritime connections are something that we now seem to be rebuilding on. We're rebuilding on old historical legacies that have almost been forgotten.
Absolutely. In fact, notice that India is the only country in the world which has an ocean named after it. So it shouldn't be that surprising that, we are surrounded by the ocean. And from very early periods, we were trading in both directions. By the way, the East Coast was trading with Southeast Asia and all the way through to Korea and so on. In fact, Korean history, by the way, starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. So it's both eastward and westward. On the west coast, we were trading with the Arabs, with the Iranians, all the way through to Mesopotamia, through the Persian Gulf, and also up the Red Sea. And so, if you were on the west coast of India in the 2nd, 3rd century of AD, and the Roman Empire is at its height, how do you think trade happened? They would use the monsoon winds to go across to Socotra, which is a small island off the coast of Yemen, and then go through to the Red Sea, sail up the coast to a bunch of these small ports, either on the Egyptian coast, in which case you would basically cross from the coast to the Nile by camel, and then sail up the Nile to Alexandria. So that was one route. Or the alternative route was that you went up to Aqaba, and which is again near the Sinai on the Jordanian-Israeli side. And then you would go past Petra. I'm sure you've heard of the great archaeological site of Petra. The reason it was important is because the Nabateans basically controlled the route. So you reached up to Aqaba by boat, you unloaded it onto camels, and then you made your way through what is now Jordan and Israel to the ports of what is the Mediterranean, basically either Israel or Lebanon. And from there, again, you sailed out further to Greece or to Italy and so on.
So if you had to recreate that spice route in the modern time and in a high-tech time, how would it actually work? You would have ships going from Mumbai or from Gujarat to Oman or to the UAE or perhaps to ports in Egypt, and from there they would have to be taken in some way to Europe, which is the tricky part. There's Israel, and there's a port of Haifa out there from where you could perhaps go either to Italy or to Greece. I mean, I know the port in Piraeus has got some Chinese influence there, so I'm not so sure about that. But we can look at where it finally goes. How would you recreate this in modern times?
Yes, and by the way, there are multiple ways of doing it. I know the media maps look as if there is only one way to think about it. But in fact, these things can connect through in very multiple ways. So, for example, you could still go up the Red Sea to Aqaba and out through Jordan to Haifa and other places. You can still go further up to Basra or to Kuwait, and you can connect through from there as well. You, of course, have this one that is being done, the one that is mostly being illustrated is being done through the UAE, through a train line through Saudi Arabia. And so there are many ways of cutting this, depending on where you're trading from. It could connect through to different things on the other side. And by the way, once this network is there, you can even connect through to Africa and do all kinds of things.
One of the reasons why perhaps Indians have forgotten about a lot of this history is because the subsequent history after that particular period wasn't always pleasant. It was the search for India, it was the search for that spice route that really brought the colonial powers out here, like the Portuguese, and then, of course, the British who came here searching for the source of all those wonderful things and those spices. Maybe that's the reason we've preferred to forget about that. But I guess the balance of power has changed now, so we need to rediscover history a bit more.
Yes, I mean, so it wasn't pleasant for multiple reasons. Not the least is that first the Portuguese, but then succession of European powers, the Dutch, many people forget the Dutch, the French, and of course the British came to control the high seas. And, Indians initially, in fact, began to develop these caste rules that crossing the seas itself was a bad thing. But even when they did cross it, they crossed it in ways that were not always pleasant. For example, as indentured labor going to places like Mauritius or Fiji or something like that. So even when you did cross the sea, it was almost as if you were going there as a quasi-slave. So the association was that the ocean was somebody else's, in somebody else's control, and you were basically, if you crossed it, it was basically some sort of a slavery. So that was the association. Now, but that was a particular point in time where there's no reason why we should forget our very glorious maritime past, which extends over thousands of years.
And if you look at the period immediately after that, which is also relevant to the entire reaching out to the Middle East, there was an entire period where, in a sense, the Middle East and the Arabs and the elephant thrown in Muscat, they were working with the Mughals, working with India in a sense to try and control this part of the ocean and keep the Europeans out. So there was a particular historical association even in that entire middle period, if you like.
So it wasn't just the Europeans. So the very interesting thing about this history is that by the time from about the 13th century, where India's own maritime prowess began to go into decline, it wasn't the Europeans that turned up to start with. It was actually the Arabs and, interestingly, the Chinese and the Indonesians who became the powers in the Indian Ocean. So there was a brief period when, in fact, in the early 1400s, when the Chinese came into the Indian Ocean, bashed everybody up, and in fact tried to do many things, including change, and this is interesting given current context, they tried to impose their own king on Sri Lanka, for example. And they then went to Indonesia and tried to kind of push back the Majapahit Empire, which was a Hindu empire in Indonesia, and so on. So the Chinese were very much involved in the early 1400s. And then because of their own internal politics between the Mandarins and the eunuchs, they kind of withdrew. And that was the vacuum that was left behind as a result of the sudden Chinese withdrawal from the Indian Ocean, was the period in which suddenly the Europeans turned up.
Well, it's really been fascinating taking a look at the history of all of this, and it's particularly important because these new relations, these new connections, these new alliances that we are now seeing apparently being developed around here, they've got legs because they are based in historic fact, they're based in history, they're based in centuries of association, and therefore the logic of this exercise still works.
Well, I mean, the history is there because of the geography. And the geography has not changed. So you have to see, if you just happen to look at a map, you can see the west coast of India is right next to Arabia and Iran. And in fact, much of our historical narrative, by the way, because of this way of thinking about it from a northern European kind of way, has got all messed up. But if you just look at a map, you can see it's pretty obvious that people living in Gujarat would be trading with people in Oman and Bahrain and so on. And that's exactly what they did. And they went back and forth and they were trading in all kinds of things. So, for example, even the Arabs, when they had ships, remember, they don't have wood. So the Arab dhow was even in the height of Arab power, built by Indians, because that's where the wood happens to be. It was built from wood from the Western Ghats. And they were sailing back and forth. And similarly, they were not just doing it at the Persian Gulf, but also up the Red Sea. I keep coming back to the Red Sea because the Red Sea is a very important part of this story, because I mentioned about the early period, Roman period and Alexandria and so on. By the period that you are talking about, they were trading through with the Venetians on the other side. So interestingly, the Venetians and the Turks were, of course, rivals. But both their economic machines were based on this trade going through from India through the Arabs and to the Turks and then to the Venetians.
But, you know, interestingly, even if you look at those associations, till well after Indian independence, a number of countries in the Middle East and around the Gulf were actually almost using the Indian rupee as legal tender, whether it is, Oman or many other countries that were using the rupee.
Not almost. They were using it because this was their currency. In fact, they didn't have central banks. So countries like Oman, Bahrain, UAE, I think even Kuwait, all of them were using the Indian rupee as their currency for a simple reason. They didn't have a central bank. They were using currencies issued by the Reserve Bank of India. And in fact, the Indian rupee had been used from ancient times. And the rupee, by the way, means literally, the rupiah is literally a silver coin. So the Indian silver coin was the currency in the Indian Ocean region, which is why even Indonesia uses rupiah. This is the main currency that was used. Even if the silver came from, Latin America, it came to India, got stamped by an Indian empire, say the Vijayanagar or the Mughals or whoever it was. And then that coin was the legal tender. So the British then inherited this. And then independent India inherited that further. So it was in the 1960s, interestingly, it was India that began to, from our side, began to discourage others from using our currency.
Well, Sanjeev, thank you so much for talking to us. I think that's a separate subject. We should talk about capital account convertibility and how India can make the rupee into legal tender again. And also, I must talk to you about that fascinating ship that you're working on. Might be sailing all the way from Kalinga to Indonesia at some point. But thank you so much for joining us on this program. Thanks a lot.